Welcome to Mind Beyond the Mission, a podcast for and by veterans and veteran family members. I'm one of your hosts, Brian McKenna, and I'm a strategic advisor at the Atlas Institute and a retired Canadian soldier.
And I'm Larissa Lamrock, strategic advisor at the Atlas Institute and a proud military family member. In this podcast, we'll be diving into real issues experienced by veterans, former RCMP members, and their families.
We won't promise you that we'll do everything perfectly, but we can assure you that we'll be getting real about the experiences that so many of us have in common, but don't always talk about, or don't necessarily know where or how to talk about it.
We hope you'll find solidarity in our words and experiences, and most importantly, that you'll find a sense of hope that things can truly get better. You can live present in the moment and live life authentically.
Let's get into it.
Brian, here we are again, recording another podcast episode. It's always exciting. I don't know about you, but I always have a little bit of nerves and such before we launch into it.
When I first met our guest, it was actually 2 days before I got hired in this job. And I wasn't allowed to actually tell anyone that I got hired in the job. So I did a podcast with her probably a good 3 years ago now. And also that day, joining the new team, it's like, who are you? Oh, I'm just a guy. Don't worry about it. So I'll always kind of remember those two things coming together.
Awesome. Well, I'm very excited that today we have with us Dr. Candice Monson. And as I was kind of preparing a bit of an introduction, I don't even know where to start, Candice. So Candice is a professor of psychology at Toronto Metropolitan University. She is an author, a researcher, an innovator with things such as cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, which we may touch on today, as well as Nelly Health. She is really a foremost expert on traumatic stress. And she's here today, which is awesome. So it could almost be a little bit intimidating having this conversation with you. I think I've told you before that, I'm a bit of a fangirl and appreciate the work that you do. But you've always made me feel very valued in my lived experience. So I very much appreciate that. When I first, met you or heard you speak, I attended a conference years ago. And it left such an impression on me because you were one of the first people, whether it would be a clinician, an academic, a researcher, a professional, talk about the importance of including families in the recovery journey for people with post-traumatic stress injury. And I was just so excited and appreciative about that. So just before we go too much further in, Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you in a second. But I just want to take a minute, if I can, if you guys can indulge me. I want to thank my spouse, Steve, because he's always supported the work that I do. In the podcast, I talk a lot about our experiences and his experience in particular, and just really appreciate his willingness to let our experience as individuals and as a couple, as a family, to talk about in a public forum. He's not here. I get to say whatever I want to say about him. So just wanted to thank that because today, and it was funny, Brian, because I approached Steve letting him know what we're talking about. It's like, hey, Steve, just let you know that Brian and I are going to be talking about intimacy. So here we are. So Brian?
Yeah, Candice, when we first met and had a chat a long time ago, it was pretty apparent to me that you care about this community. Maybe we can start there because, when we're looking at our work and who we're going to work with and partner with, there's lots of tests to see how we get there. But mine is to try to get a sense of if they actually know who these people are and want to work with them. And you do. So welcome to the show. Why don't you give people a little bit of a background as to who you are?
Sure. Thank you, Brian and Larissa. It really is a pleasure to be here because you are two standouts in this community, and to be invited to come and talk with you about such a great topic that I feel like is not talked about enough is such a pleasure. So I'm very excited about our time together. What got me interested in this area, and I'm now, almost 30 years into this gig, is that from a kind of the largest part of the funnel is the idea of people transforming. So in the case of people having experienced trauma and then coming out the other side and watching that transformation and being gifted, I truly feel like it's a gift to be let into people's lives about some of the most intimate, sometimes humiliating, shame-producing, terrifying kinds of experiences, and then to walk with them alongside them as a co-traveler in that journey is incredibly important. And then I would say specifically in terms of the military veteran first responder population, there is something for me that's very compelling about service, to give yourself over for your country, for your fellow Canadian or American or whatever country to serve in order to protect democracy and to protect our rights. Like, that's at a very philosophical level. Like, it's very moving for me. And I think that population gets put in some of the most precarious situations in terms of the puzzles to unravel. And so I think that's why, 30 years later, I'm still doing this and feel so compelled by the work I do and love what I do.
Well, and you mentioned earlier in that, Candice, you mentioned transition. And I'll tell you an interesting transition is that 10 years ago, I used to be training platoons of infantrymen. What on earth am I doing on the air talking about intimacy? But, when Larissa and I first talked about not just this episode, but the podcast as a whole, the whole idea was to be a little bolder and discuss the things no one actually talks about, but talks about in whispers. And this is it. And we had the courage to have this conversation. And even then, it has still taken us about a year to put pen to paper and now a microphone to our faces and actually do it. So even though you're giving us some credit and we're saying we want to do this, we're hesitant to have the discussion. So let's maybe go into that. Is it taboo? Is it just this, like we're taking the veil off here? Because at the end of the day, I think I have a statement to make, which is intimacy gets beaten up by mental health issues. It just gets kicked around. And I wonder if bringing that into the light can make it any better.
I think that's such an important idea, like getting it out of the shadows in terms of destigmatizing it and being able to have some conversations about it. Because even in therapy, people are reluctant to talk about it. And believe it or not, therapists are reluctant to ask about it. So it comes up more frequently in the context of couple therapy. Sex and intimacy is a major part of who we are as humans, but yet we tend not to talk about it. I think it's, and to be honest, it's especially true in North America for a variety of reasons that we could talk about, but gets very disrupted with mental health. And especially when people have been traumatized, because, by its very nature, a lot of traumas occur at the hands of other people. And intimacy is a very intrusive, positively intrusive, but it's still intrusive, right? So you can imagine how it can get disrupted, and a lot of symptoms of various disorders can interfere with intimacy. And then some of the treatments that we use biologically also interfere with intimacy.
Yeah, and that's something I just wanted to be clear that I think a lot of people assume when we use the word intimacy, we're talking about sex.
Only.
The physicality, only, exactly. And I think all of us, as we kind of prepped for this, acknowledge, so just want to kind of let our listeners in on that backstory that we're talking about intimacy. Yes, absolutely, sex is an important part of it. But I think the sense of connection, I think that's where my mind goes to when I speak about intimacy.
And not avoiding each other, like actually being in each other's space and being comfortable with it.
Yeah. And so I'm intrigued by a little bit of what you're talking about. How many things around mental health, both on the part of the person with the diagnosis, but also on the supporter side, all of the various factors that come in to impact intimacy. And, maybe there's loss of trust. Maybe there's loss of self-worth for someone. What do you see in particular that that some of the things that impact intimacy when it comes to veterans and mental health specifically?
Yeah, for sure. Two things I want to go back and touch back to, and then we'll go forward. I do think it's really important, the point you made about thinking about intimacy as a multidimensional construct.
Okay.
So when I say that, meaning like there's just all kinds of different intimacy. Like there's even, if you want to get really broad, there's the intimacy of standing in a store at the self-checkout next to someone, like we're in proximity and in connection, even in those cases, or we're in connection and intimacy with our kids or with our intimate partner, with our friends. So I think it's a really good point. And there's physical, there's emotional, there's even cognitive intimacy. Like there are people who actually are turned on and feel close to people because of their intellect, right? So being sapiosexual, for example. So there's like so many different dimensions to intimacy and what makes us feel connected to people. So I think that's a really good point. And going forward to your question, I think there are so many different mental health symptoms that can interfere with connection and intimacy. So like just taking two, for example, to illustrate. So I think anxiety, right? So if you think about anxiety as a heightened fight or flight response, right? So your body feels like there's some threat. When we are feeling threatened and we're anxious, evolutionarily, our bodies, our minds, our emotions are not designed to connect, right? We're in a space of figuring out what could be threatening. And that can interfere then with the sexual response cycle, for example, in all kinds of ways, right? It can interfere with even feeling like you want to get close to anyone. It can interfere with being able to get an erection or to have vaginal lubrication because your head's in a different place, just as a couple examples. And if you're feeling under threat, you probably aren't having discussions with people revealing yourself because you think something's coming at you that could be dangerous. Another example would be with depression, right? If you're feeling low mood, you're going to be less motivated. Things are going to feel less gratifying to you. It's hard to, enjoy things that were once pleasurable. And that's just a couple of examples of how kind of the most common mental health conditions can interfere. And I think it's really important. While Larissa said the term supporter, I do want to say that sometimes, supporters have their own mental health issues too. Like we are talking about veterans, but in their own right, the loved ones of those with conditions also have their own mental health challenges that might interfere with their ability to have emotional and physical and cognitive closeness. So I think we have to think about kind of how everyone in that system is coming together to dance around intimacy. And, intimacy, even if you're healthy, is hard, let alone when you have these conditions.
And, you mentioned, Candice, that we're not just talking about sex, but we absolutely are talking about it. And one of the things that that I think I've seen, especially speaking to, male and female peers over the years, the systems that are out there understand the term erectile dysfunction. But when women have been coming forward and saying, physical sexual dysfunction for me, where's that? Where's there an understanding that we have this too? When I heard that the first time, I then heard a chorus from the rest of the room going, yeah, exactly. And it was years into working with other veterans before I'd actually realized that this is understood, under-needed, underserved, under everything. And is that common? And why are we there?
Yeah. Brian, good on you to bring that up. Just because I think one of the major reasons that there's been sort of more focus on male sexual dysfunction is because of the medications used to help with erectile dysfunction, right? And we don't have as sort of obvious strategies that are biological. That's not to say we don't have strategies to help with sexual desire and sexual preparation for women. But I think we, societally, we probably live in a place where there's a little bit more focus on that for men versus women. The other thing I was thinking about as you were talking is absolutely both men and women have sexual assaults that can impact on sexual functioning, right? So And it's only relatively more recent, and I say relatively more recent, that we focused on these sexual assaults and brought light on that and how that can impact on people's wanting to even get close to anyone when there's that kind of violation that can interfere with functioning. But I want to just put a bold underscore highlight around the fact that all kinds of gendered people struggle with sexual and emotional functioning. And it's really important for us to address that for everyone, because it is a very human need that we all have.
I think I'd like to unpack some of that. We're touching on a few different things, and I think I'd just kind of like to review them a little bit for people who might be listening about what potentially could be impacting intimacy and relationships. So we've talked a little bit about the symptoms of the diagnosis. So even, for example, someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, if they're feeling hypervigilant or triggered, there's other things are kind of secondary on the list. We talked about some of the symptoms of depression. We touched a little bit on people's experiences and psychological impacts. So, if they've experienced sexual trauma of some kind, that can impact or impede it. Different types of trauma, I would imagine, can impact it. I'm going to guess that there could be medication issues. Medications that folks take can impact intimacy. So
Absolutely.
whether it's physical functioning incapacity, or even some folks have talked about feeling numb when they're on medications. So that can inhibit it. So, and then from the caregiver side, and thank you, Candice, for acknowledging and talking about that. And that's something Brian and I have chatted about, in over the year of kind of building up to this, is how does that impact a relationship when you are in a role where you feel you're a caregiver for someone who is your intimate partner? It's really hard, to flip a switch back and forth. Okay, now I'm the caregiver. Now I'm the, the intimate partner, and we're going to get jiggy with it. It's kind of hard to flip that.
I think of it as, whether it's a romantic relationship or not, you're at a peer level. Well, that peer level, if I can call it that, when that becomes, 80% caretaker and 20% patient, where's the love? Where is it? And I think it kind of goes out the door with that relationship shift.
Well, maybe this is leading us to a next question for you, Candice. So how can people, and maybe we're going there really, really quickly, but there's so much to talk about here. How can people regain intimacy when they find themselves in that space where there's that disconnect? And so whether it's the physical intimacy or and I think physical intimacy so much starts with that, I just feel connected to you. I just want to spend time with you. I just want to be beside you. To me, there's an evolution there. So if people are feeling, if they've lost that love and feeling, I've worked in 2 song lyrics so far. I'm pretty proud of myself.
Nice.
I'm going to.
Righteous letters I picked up, by the way.
Could make
done.
That's right. So do you have some thoughts on how people can take some steps towards finding each other again?
Yeah. So funny. Now I was like, okay, what clever song lyric can I?
Well, let's talk about sex is
beat?
obvious. I mean,
That's right. How can we restore that? Oh, there's so many things. 2 things I wanted to say that while you were both speaking, one thing I neglected to say, but Larissa, good on you that you mentioned, is emotional numbing is one of the key culprits in not establishing intimacy. And just to talk about that for a second, sharing our thoughts and feelings with other people, whether it's a romantic or not relationship, is really what glues us to other people. It's kind of the attachment cement for our connection to other people. So if you're having a hard time even figuring out what am I feeling because I'm numb, either because I'm taking medications that numb me or by virtue of the disorder, the longer that post-traumatic stress disorder goes along, it's kind of like a cancer. It will kill your emotionality. And it may be because you're trying to get rid of the negative emotions, but you're killing the positive too. So in doing the diagnosis, oftentimes as a clinician, I'll say, tell me about the positive feelings you have. Are you able to feel connected and experience love or joy with someone else. And it's one of the most disabling parts of the disorder as it relates to intimacy. So thank you for underscoring that. And also just to say the medication, specifically the SSRIs, so the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and the SNRIs, like that class is particularly notorious for making it hard to have an orgasm, for example, and kind of to numb people out. So I think those are really good points. I also think that institutionally, it has been a little bit dangerous for us to use the terms caregiver, like the caregiver support program in the US, and to call people caregivers. Like, the system that's happening in a family may already set that up, but then now we've reified that's your role, which I think it's really important, even if that is what the institution is saying, that within a family that wants to get well, is that there is, as Brian said, an egalitarian, equal partnership, and not one person that's one down, because you're going to get parentified as the partner. So I know I didn't answer your question, but I think anything that brings the functioning of the person who has mental health problems up, and like if I was that therapist, is to really talk about how is your family structured so that each of you are making contributions that are important to the family, because it starts there. It starts in those most basic ways. And Brian, it sounds like you may have something you're wanting to add on about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And, maybe this is my turn of stump the doctor, but I'm going to operationalize this a little bit because I think this will matter to the community. If this was World War II, the first time a soldier would see a woman would be a nurse when they got hurt. If this was World War II, your other exposure to women might be on leave. And it's no shock then that thousands of Canadian servicemen came home with brides that they'd either met that were nurses or they'd met while they were on leave in England. That was your exposure to women during conflict. In Vietnam was the first time really that women and children started being weaponized. Suddenly, children were carrying bombs into trenches and things like that. And now in these urban conflicts that we see, particularly in asymmetrical warfare, in a warfare that doesn't have another country as your opponent, but you have a non-state actor, a group, your perpetrators are using women and children, using our morals against us, and the victims are women and children. The last major event I dealt with in Afghanistan had 17 people killed in it, and the vast majority of them were women. That is a new military experience to the human experience. Do you think that affects us when we come home? And now, even though it's a woman that we know, that we love, that we have a history with, I've now seen women in a different light. Women can be the enemy now. Does that play out?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I've never had someone articulate that interesting in 25 years, but it makes total sense.
Well, I don't know that I'm right.
And it would be a very hard thing to study rigorously, but from psychological theory, that would make sense. Like just that women represent different things. When you've had those kinds of experiences, children would represent things. I can tell you the closest thing I've seen is I've had patients who didn't want to hold children, didn't want to be around children because they had been in situations where they had to harm children, like running a convoy and having to proceed. And so it makes sense then to extrapolate that it would be what's interesting about it is suddenly you have, let's just take women, and it has all kinds of associations. So it has positive associations, but it has negative too. And so now it's a complicated thing to interact with. That's a very interesting, Brian. Yeah, I can see how that would be a further complication to the story.
Well, I think that touches on, we've spoken a little bit about depression, anxiety, PTSI, but I think moral injury has a factor as well. So what the two of you have just been discussing somewhat might fall into moral injury. And so something that I've found of interest is that I alluded to it before, when a veteran is struggling with moral injury and that sense of self-worth, and they have a hard time accepting themselves. If I can't love myself, how can I be worthy of someone else loving me? So when I did peer support in years prior, I would hear that from family members saying, I feel like my veteran, my spouse, is pushing me away. And I think that can be reciprocated. I just want to be fair here in that, you touched on caregiver, and I very consciously use the term supporter. I bristle at the term caregiver because it does put a responsibility. Just by calling me a caregiver, there's an onus and a responsibility there. But I think if family members have felt that they have been put in a caregiver role, maybe they're experiencing compassion fatigue, and maybe they're experiencing resentment. And so they might be putting a wall up. So yeah, that's where I was getting at. And I think I'm really appreciating this conversation because I wonder if couples who are struggling with intimacy, they might not have put consideration to all of these things. Maybe it's the symptoms, maybe it's the medication, maybe I need to do a check. Like, where am I at with, my feelings of resentment or self-worth or anything else? Because I think a lot of folks in a couple, when there's a breakdown in intimacy, they think it's me and it's because I'm not attractive. It's me and it's because of all these other factors, when really there can be a lot of other kind of contributing things to it.
Yeah. So, okay, there's so many things I could say.
I know we could talk forever on this.
I love it. Oh my God. Hopefully this might be a series. So I'm going to say something maybe controversial for the listenership, which is, I even think because words matter, I even think supporters, like veteran and supporters, like veterans also are supporting their spouses. Like it's support goes both directions. Hallelujah. Right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like if we're aiming for health, if we're like aspiring for health and we are wanting to increase intimacy, two things that I think would be really important to think about as couples is, one is if there's a high conflict, you really first things first, you do want to try to get high conflict down, because that's very deteriorating of wanting to be close to someone. Like, why would I reveal about myself if I think it's going to be weaponized by my partner, right? So in terms of like increasing intimacy of all kinds with anyone, you got to work to get conflict down. I think that's incredibly important. And I think the second thing that, like, I'm just thinking about the best tips I would have, like high yield, low cost. The other one is like something you said, Larissa, which is the tendency to mind read. And all of us do it. We all, especially with those we're closest to, if it's not going right, we all get in other people's heads, and we rarely mind read to the positive.
That's true.
Right? We tend to mind read to the negative, and we tend to not give our partners the benefit of the doubt. So I think to whatever extent we can get conflict down and mind reading, trying to be more agnostic with those that we love. About, when I say agnostic, meaning not assuming the worst or the best, but just like I'm open-minded, and then checking it out, and for there to be able to be a dialogue. And then I'm going to bridge that back to your comment about moral injury. So a lot of moral injuries have a lot of guilt and shame wrapped around them. And what shame wants us to do is go underground, right? We don't want to reveal about ourselves because we're ashamed, right? So there's a tendency to want to turtle or ostrich. And one of the best antidotes to shame is revealing oneself and having someone not think we're despicable. So to the degree possible, for people who are having a lot of shame for whatever it's about, whether it's a moral injury or it's shame regarding some behavior that you've done, being able to shed light on it and have someone see you and still love and accept you is incredibly important in that healing process.
Anger versus resentment. I'd like to hear a little bit about that. I think,
Yeah,
there's going to be arguments. Stuff's going to happen. Things will come up.
absolutely.
And then
Yeah.
often there's anger about that. But in my opinion, and I've certainly walked this path myself, anger shows up, but give it some time and it kind of dissipates. But resentment sticks a little bit more, right? And there's a lot of things like I don't want to tie everything to the deployment scenario, but it's a pretty big scenario to tackle. And, when we go away, for example, and then we come home, or even when you go away in so much as doing like a 20-year career, if you go to an event with your spouse, I've got the uniform, I've got the medals, everyone knows my rank, who I am. There's a persona, whether you're a private or a general, and then there's the spouse of. And, I'd be resentful. Let's put it that way. If this role was reversed and everywhere I went, I was introduced as being in this room because you're attached to that person, I would resent being squished and buried under that. So how about that? Is resentment stickier or worse in terms of intimacy than anger?
Well, it's interesting because the thing that came to mind for some of your listeners who might struggle with substance use issues, resentment is apparently the number one offender for people with substance use. Like
really,
the desire to want to kind of drink away resentment. Yeah. So the way I would think about anger is just as you describe it. It's a bit of can be a bit of a flash fire. Like, we have our emotionality. Like that's what makes us human, right? We have emotions. Resentment is sort of entrenched anger. And people tend to feed resentment, right? So you kind of go over and over and over it, and then it gets just more entrenched and gets deep and ugly. The best antidote to the scenario that you talked about, for the person who's got the light shined on them, whatever it is there, verb tense, is to share the light, so that you're not the plus one always. And I think really good couples are good at shining light on their partner in a positive way and sharing the light to help combat that. But sure, you could have resentment of not feeling. And I think a lot of veterans families feel like that when they were active duty and after the fact is like, well, I'm an afterthought to this scenario, kind of not appreciating how important families are, which has been a part of what I've been trying to, for a number of years to say, woo, these people really matter in their own right, but also to fulfill your operational, organizational needs, and also in terms of the rehab and recuperation after the fact.
And, I think one of the things in my role here is not just on this podcast, but at the Atlas Institute, is just trying to remind people of how the day job creeps into every aspect of your life. So I'll give you an example of what I'm speaking about here is when that person you're with, that intimate partner, is about to go away and do a job for 6, 7, 8 months, there's your spouse leaving, there's your partner leaving. When they come back, you might be in a situation where you've got to go and be intimate with the person who just bombed ISIS. Be intimate with the person that for the last 7 months has been calling airstrikes on the Taliban. Be intimate with a sniper who's just been working in Mosul, Iraq. Is there some part of that comes into play? And I'm not questioning whether our partners love us, care about us. What I'm asking is, does the nastiness of the day job, does that come into the bedroom?
Oh, it certainly can, for sure. And honestly, I just had a session with a police officer, talking about their job and feeling there's creep. I mean, in this case, it was like how I was interacting with my kid. But yeah, of course, it's for all of us not to bring our day job home into, our closest relationship is a struggle. And, one of the things I think is really important is taking care of ourselves as individuals. I mean, there is the piece of us interacting with each other, which is the focus of today, in intimacy of all kinds. But we all have a personal responsibility to take care of ourselves individually too. I was talking with this particular officer about doing the have-tos. You've got to sleep, make sure you're sleeping well. You got to make sure you're eating well. Are you exercising? For this person, they were, had previously done meditation, more mindfulness strategies, because, of course, it's possible for that to bleed in and to have some associations, as you were saying, with people that then get associated, those close relationships with other close relationships. Yeah, of course.
So I think we've drawn attention to, different types of intimacy, what can affect that intimacy kind of from both sides. Where do folks go from here? If there's listeners kind of, if this is shedding some light or ringing really close to home for them, where do they go from here? And it sounds like there might be a few steps. I mean, taking care of yourself first. So, and the family unit sounds like, and the couple. So if someone's listening, Candice, what's the next steps?
One thing I was thinking about, Larissa, is probably people are on, different places in the journey. So for maybe the person who's listening and early on, I would want to send the message that it is possible for things to get better, like hope, that there are treatments to make things better. There is credible information out there, in terms of getting oneself kind of educated. So Atlas is a credible source of information for those people who have PTSD. The United States VA, National Center for PTSD website, is a really good source of information. But I think the number one thing is there is hope. No matter how dark it feels, that there is the possibility of things getting better. And I feel like this is a place where my own lived experience comes in. I've watched people who've suffered for 30 plus years with disorders get better. So it is possible. The other thing I would say for people who are maybe a little further along in the journey is, and this may be controversial too, but I'll say it, which is, are you getting good treatment? Are you getting good intervention? Because one of the things about the current landscape of mental health is it's a cottage industry. And so there's just a lot of variability in what people can get in the community, and just maybe thinking a little bit, educating yourself a little bit about what you should be getting in terms of quality treatment. So for instance, there's science-backed couple therapy, science-backed individual therapy, and just encouraging people to get to those therapies that will increase the likelihood that you get better. Those are the first things that come to mind.
And, one thing I've noticed in this chat and also in other conversations, it seems to be that there's commonality. You called them the have-tos or must-dos, or whatever. If we were having a conversation on traumatic brain injury, as we just recently have, one of the key pieces of advice was good eating, good sleeping, good exercise. I went through cancer 2 years ago. People have asked me what to do. I've told them good eating, good sleeping, good exercise, and listen to your doctor and actually do the things you're told. And here we are again, talking about something within people's lives that's of critical importance. And I think sometimes people are waiting to hear this really complicated answer. And at the end of the day, one of the simple answers that I'm hearing here is, guess what, guys? Go to bed, get up, have some routine, eat properly, move your body around. And it seems to be, it's prevalent in everything. And here we are again, eat well, sleep well, exercise.
Do the do's, again, in the recovery community, start back to the basics that are really important to as a foundation, right? I do think that there is, and you made me think about it, Brian. So in my business, we would say there are common factors, right? There are common factors to all the things that work. including just taking care of yourself in the most biological ways. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you moving? Duh. I think there's a little bit of an interesting tendency in the world of trauma recovery for people to want these like magic fixes, like these quick fixes, like, okay, what's the next thing? When the reality is getting better there are probably some common factors to that too, which is in the case of trauma recovery is kind of facing down what it is that you fear. And there are different ways of doing that, but kind of what works for people who are depressed, anxious, have PTSD. It's a lot of approaching and facing. It's age-old adage, but you're going to get what you put into it. And there's probably nothing that's going to be hands that are going to be laid on that are going to really fix it. And it takes a lot of hard work by couples and families and individuals to make that happen.
So it kind of brings me back to the beginning of this conversation that it's taken a little bit of courage on Brian and my behalf to have this conversation. Putting it out there, intimacy is something that I have had to struggle with and examine, like how I'm not closing myself off from my spouse and maintaining that sense of connection. And so, I guess I would encourage folks to be courageous, because one of the other factors is I don't think you can sort this out on your own. You either need to connect with your spouse or connect with a professional and partake in psychotherapy, talk therapy to help you work through it. Be courageous because it can be a really tough conversation to have.
And I think, some of the things we trained you to do when you were serving don't serve you all that well in this area. So be okay with learning something new. Part of how you survived that previous part of your life was learning how to disassociate. Just the facts, ma'am. I investigate a scene not by figuring out how everyone feels, by trying to figure out what happened, and that's it. And how could this go really bad for me right now? And it's going to take probably some deliberate work and training to get out of that mode and get back into, I got to connect with this person. It's difficult. And that's, if I give advice to people, it's like, well, let's be okay to train for this too. Wow, I just did a podcast on intimacy. Like, what the heck just happened to me?
You made it. Look at you. You're brave. This was awesome. Thank you guys so very much.
Candice, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us in this brave discussion and the insights that you provided.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thank you for bringing this conversation to bear. It was fantastic.
And we'll see everyone soon again on Mind Beyond the Admission. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Mind Beyond the Mission.
If this conversation resonated with you or helped you in any way, I encourage you to subscribe to Mind Beyond the Mission wherever you listen to your podcasts, so you'll be the first to know when our next episode comes out.
And if you know someone who might relate to what we've shared or could find it helpful, please feel free to send it their way. We're all on the same team.
Plus, we'd love to hear what other topics you'd be interested in us exploring in future episodes. Brian and I have a lot of ideas and subjects we plan to dive into, but you, the listener, have probably experienced or thought of topics that haven't crossed our minds yet.
Please reach out if this is the case. We're on social media at Atlas Veterans CA on most platforms, so please feel free to tweet at us, send us a message, or leave a review on this episode, and let us know what else you'd like to hear us talk about.
Brian, it's always a pleasure having these important conversations with you. Looking forward to next time.
You bet, Larissa. Take it easy.